The traditional translation of Genesis 1:1 is in the beginning, comma, God created the heavens and the earth. There is a more modern translation that is when God began to create the heavens and the earth. If you take the modern translation of when God began creating the heavens and the earth, he doesn't create out of nothing. He's working with something that already exists. For me, it's a pretty big mountain to climb to say that all of that linguistic evidence from the Hebrew Bible can be ignored because the church has traditionally believed that it means in the beginning.
Hello everyone, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I'm talking with Dr. Henry Sun to talk about why your modern translations of Genesis 1 is wrong and what the real translation should be. This has led many scholars to say this discussion is beyond dispute. Hello, Dr. Henry. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little about your background, and how you're doing today?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate on your channel. My name is Henry Sun. I have been a student of the Bible for as long as I can remember. My family attended a Free Methodist church in Rochester, New York, which is where I was saved as a high school student. I followed that up by going to Wheaton College, where I earned an undergraduate degree in biblical studies and then a master's degree in theology. I followed that by going to Claremont Graduate School in Southern California, where I earned my Ph.D. in Old Testament studies. I did my dissertation in the book of Leviticus. I currently work as a pastor for Heritage Presbyterian Church in Benicia, California, and I am also a public high school math teacher in my spare time, whatever that is. But I am doing fine today. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation, and I hope that the people who will watch it and listen to it will be interested in it as well.
Awesome. It's exciting. Okay, let's get into it. So, Dr. Sun, can you tell us just general views on the topic before? Obviously, you have in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Right.
Apparently, there's some other translations that you want to talk about. And can you talk about those, your translation, as well as what the significance is of it?
Sure. So the traditional translation of Genesis 1:1 in the New International Version and the New American Standard Bible and the New English Translation is in the beginning, comma, God created the heavens and the earth. There is a more modern translation that's reflected in the New Jewish Publication Society Hebrew Bible, or Tanakh, that is when God began to create the heavens and the earth. So that Genesis 1:1 starts with a dependent clause, a subordinate clause, not an independent clause. And then the New Revised Standard Version and the New American Bible are ones that try kind of to join this together. And they have a translation that says, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth. So those are the three basic options that exist for Genesis 1:1. I think that the grammar of the Hebrew language is strongly in favor of the modern translation, when God began to create. And hopefully I'll be able to walk your audience through those reasons why.
Cool. So obviously you're going to have some people be like, okay, who cares whether it's one or the other? So can you talk a little bit about the significance about like why this is so important?
Sure. If you follow the traditional understanding, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, it seems to point to an absolute beginning of God's creative activity in the heavens and the earth. One of the issues with that scholars and theologians point out is that if you take Genesis 1:1 as the absolute beginning of God's creation, then the first thing that happens is that the world is in chaos. The chaos is reflected in verse 2. The earth was formless and void, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you take the modern translation of when God began creating the heavens and the earth being formless and void, then God is working on something that already exists. He doesn't create creation out of nothing. He's working with something that already exists. And that is the theological difference between the two different translations of in the beginning, comma, God created, and when God began creating, or when God began to create the earth being formless and void. Then God said, let there be light. And then he begins to bring order out of an already existing chaotic situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So as far as the views throughout history, it seems to me like this most popular view has been the traditional one, which is in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And it seems like you're saying it's modern, so that means it seemed to be new. So like, has anyone else taken this view in the past?
Now I am not a scholar of rabbinic Judaism. I understand that there are medieval Jewish scholars who have analyzed the Hebrew and come up with the same reading that I have. When we say traditional in this context, traditional means traditional within the Christian world. At least that is how most people would use and understand that word. And it's traditional for a reason. I mean, this is what the church has tended to believe through most of its history. This is kind of the origin of the young earth debate versus the old earth debate. Did God create everything with the snap of his fingers, and then 24 hours later there was light, and then 24 hours later there was water, and there was heaven, and so on and so forth? That is one reading of Genesis 1 that presumes that the reading in the beginning, comma, God created points to a definite point in time. Your readers may remember hearing of a guy named Bishop Ussher, who decided that the world was created in October of 4004. He did that by just taking all of those time references literally and working backwards to a point where he could say it had to have been in October of 4004 when God first said, let there be light. If God is working with a creation, a chaos that already exists, then who knows when that time was? And then there's no reason to support any type of a young earth creationist hypothesis for Genesis 1:1, because there is no absolute moment in time that Genesis talks about where God created something. So the traditional view is traditional within the Christian church because it's what the church has traditionally believed throughout most of its existence. I can't name the scholars in the history of interpretation that have taken a different point of view. That's not my area of expertise, but I'm sure that someone has. Someone's written a dissertation or a book or something on that somewhere in the digital world somewhere. I just haven't read it and don't know what it is.
There's obviously the popular view that Genesis 1:1 is a summary statement of the entire creation account. Would you say that your view on this would mean that it's not the summary statement, or would it be possible that we'd still take your view, but it be the summary at the same time?
I think that what Genesis 1:1 is doing is it's not functioning as a summary statement because it's not a complete sentence. It's a in my understanding, Genesis 1:1 says, when God began creating the heavens and the earth. Now, if you want to read that like as a title, I guess maybe that would work. It seems like it's part of the first chapter of Genesis. That's not a question that I've really thought about because I am convinced that it is part of a longer sentence that includes verses 1 to 3. So I really, that's not really something I want to comment on before I could do some more thinking and reading on it. My initial inclination is to not agree with it because it looks like Genesis 1:1 is part of that longer complex sentence, Genesis 1:1 through 3. But I wouldn't want to commit myself to it one way or another without looking at the question first.
Can you tell us what your argument is for why we should take your view?
And here's where I lay out the kind of the three basic options that we have for translating Genesis 1:1. Now go to the second slide. Okay, so Hebrew has no word to express what grammarians call the genitive relationship, which in English is expressed by the word of. So we might say the house of David in English, but Hebrew expresses that construction in a different way. And that different way is called the construct form. It changes the way the first word in the clause, in this case, the word house, is pronounced. And so instead of adding the word of, the way we do in English, or instead of changing the case ending of the second word, the way it's done in Greek, Hebrew changes the vocalization of the first word. And we call that changed vocalization in Hebrew the construct form of a word. Go to the next slide, please. So in English, we would say the way of the world. But Hebrew would only use 2 words instead of 5. It would say way of and put the word way in construct form. And then it would follow that with the world in its normal form. And because the world has the definite article, the whole phrase would be considered to be definite. So technically it would be way of the world, but since the world is definite, it makes the whole phrase definite. And so it becomes the way of the world. So that's the way the Hebrew works. It has a 2-word construction, way of in construct, and the world written as 1 word. And because the word the world has a definite article, the whole phrase is considered to be definite. In Hebrew, then, the construct form of the noun, as I've mentioned before, is marked by a different pronunciation of the noun. So the word word in Hebrew is pronounced dabar with 2 A vowels, da and bar. But the construct form is pronounced bar with that first A becoming a very short E vowel. So davar becomes davar. So in Hebrew, we would say the word is ha-davar, but the word of God would be davar ha-Elohim. Ha-Elohim is the Hebrew word for God. It has a definite article, H-A, that's the Hebrew definite article. So the phrase davar ha-Elohim becomes the word of God, as opposed to the construction ha-davar, that first one, which is simply the word. So hopefully that makes clear the change in spelling and pronunciation of the word when it becomes a construct form connected with the word that follows it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So would you say that if a word has a letter and then the E kind of like above it to the right, then that means it's necessarily in the construct form?
Most of the time, that is the case. Like every language, Hebrew has its exceptions. But most of the time, the change in vowels is a very good indication that a word is in the construct form as opposed to a different form. There are some forms, like the word melech for king, where you don't have the change of vowels, but that's a different class of word that's not part of Genesis 1:1. So while it is true, it's not relevant to the conversation about Genesis 1:1. Okay. Now, it works the same way with prepositions. If we wanted to say in Hebrew, in the day, we would pronounce it ba yom. Notice there's an A after the letter B. The letter B stands for a preposition in Hebrew. But if we wanted to say in the day of David, we wouldn't say ba yom, we'd say b yom David, where the A in the phrase in the day becomes that short E in the second sentence. So B'yom David would be translated in the day of David, whereas Bayom would be translated in the day. So in the day, back in the day, comma, I used to drive a stick shift. You might use the word Bayom. But if I wanted to say in the day that my dad taught me, then I might use B'yom, something like that. The very first word of Genesis 1:1 has triggered this debate. Is it in construct form or not? The traditional interpretation of Genesis 1:1 is that it is not in the construct form, that it is not related to the word that follows it. That's why they had the beginning in the translation, in the beginning, comma, because it's separate from the words that follow it, God created the heavens and the earth. The alternative view, which is the view that I support, is that it is in construct. So the translation becomes, in the beginning of God creates, becomes when God began to create. So the whole grammatical issue in Genesis 1:1 has to do with the question, is the first word of the Hebrew Bible in construct form or not? I believe that it is. The traditional interpretations believe that it is not. And that the answer to that question is what determines how you're going to translate Genesis 1:1. Now, the online NET translator's note to Genesis 1:1 lays out the problem precisely. I found this note from netbible.org. I'm going to start by saying this online study Bible is by far my favorite study Bible. It has something like 68,000 translator notes or historical notes or maps or things like that. It is by far the most comprehensive study Bible that is available to students of the Bible. And because it's online at netbible.org, it's literally free for everybody. So without meaning to be a shill for Net Bible, I'm going to highly recommend it for your pastors, your teachers, and your students as a place to go to get a lot of really, really good information. But in its note to Genesis 1:1, the online NET says this: the translation assumes that the form translated beginning is in the absolute state rather than the construct state. So notice they identify the construct in the beginning of, where they have that word of that we've talked about in previous slides, or when God created, or when God began creating, if you want to use the notion of, put the notion of beginning into the translation. And that is the exact problem of Genesis 1:1. It is assuming that the form is in the absolute state. But as I hope to show in the rest of the slides, that assumption is wrong. Okay.
So just to be clear, we have two options. We have absolute or construct. Is that our two choices?
Correct. The absolute state assumes that the translation should be in the beginning, like bayom, in the day, or hadavar, the way, the word. The construct state would assume that it's connected to the second word, which we normally translate in English with the word of. That's why they include in the beginning of. So that is right. Okay. Can you go to the next slide? Okay. So there are three reasons, in my opinion, why the NET Bible and the traditional interpretation is wrong in its grammatical analysis. First of all, there are other occurrences of this word in the Old Testament that are not ambiguous. So in my opinion, if the other occurrences of this word are unambiguously in the construct state, then the burden of proof falls on the other scholars to show why that would not be true in Genesis 1:1. And I talk about that in the next slide. There are similar grammatical constructions in the Old Testament that don't use the word beginning, but use a different designation of time. that are also in the construct state. And then finally, there is a groundbreaking article by the Hebrew scholar Robert Holmstedt that, in my opinion, provides the final piece to the puzzle as to why this particular grammatical construction is not unique in the rest of the Hebrew Bible. And we'll spend most of the time on numbers 1 and 2 and some of the time on number 3, because I'm talking about articles by Hebrew scholars to a non-Hebraic audience can be difficult. So we'll talk mostly about the other occurrences of the word in the Old Testament. Okay. Next slide, please. So the first word of Genesis 1:1 is bereshit. It occurs in this exact form in 4 other places in the Hebrew Bible, and I list them here. And if you look at your translations, almost all of them will treat this word bereshit as a word in construct, that is translated with the word of. So in Genesis 26:1, the translations normally say, at the beginning of the reign of a certain king. And in Genesis 27:1, it says, in the beginning of the reign of a certain king. And in Jeremiah 28:1, at the beginning of the reign of a certain king. And in Jeremiah 49:34, at the beginning of the reign of a certain king. And in all of these cases, it is beyond dispute that the word bereshit is in construct. No translation to my knowledge says, in the beginning, comma, the reign of so-and-so king. In the beginning, comma, the reign of so-and-so king. All of the translations that I regularly check treat this word bereshit as a word that's in construct with the word that follows it. And that would be the normal grammatical interpretation of these 4 verses. Next slide, please. Now, if we consider that evidence alone, it seems clear that the word bereshit is itself in the construct form. And the argument that it is not in construct ignores the linguistic evidence from the rest of the Hebrew Bible. I think that this is the strongest reason for why we should believe that bereshit is in construct. Every other place it occurs in construct, translated with the word of. And as I mentioned earlier, if someone wants to look at those 4 passages and say, well, it's in construct form in Jeremiah, but it's not in construct form in Genesis, I sure want to know why they thought the exact same word was not. And I think that's a pretty important argument in this case. Next slide. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah. So if you look at the previous slide we have here, it says at the beginning, in the beginning, at the beginning, at the beginning of. None of these say when. They never begin with when. It doesn't seem like it matches your translation. So, yeah.
Sure. So when we say, so if I were to translate Genesis 1:1 literally and say, at the beginning of God creates, would that make much sense in English?
No.
No. So when translators change the word at to when, they're trying to make the construction more understandable in English. In the same way, if you look at Jeremiah 27:1 and you move it into Genesis 1, would it make sense in English to say, in the beginning of God creates? And again, the answer is no. That's just a very weird sentence that we'd hear in English. So it's an attempt by translators to kind of smooth over the reading. The preposition b, which if you look at that Hebrew word, the first 2 letters are a b and then that raised e. That preposition b is a preposition that can mean in, at, when, around, all those kinds of things. So the choice of the word when is based more on the need of getting a a translation that makes sense to an English reader than to be the literal one-for-one translation of the word at or in, the way it's done here in Jeremiah 26, 27, 28, and 49.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Now, but those passages from Jeremiah raise a different problem. In these four texts, the word following bereshit is a noun. It's the reign of a certain king. In Genesis 1:1, the word following bereshit is a finite verbal form. He created. So if we wanted to translate as literally and woodenly as possible, we'd say that Genesis 1:1 is in the beginning of, God created. That is a different grammatical construction than we have in Jeremiah, because the word he created is a verb. It's not a noun, right? So this is not Jeremiah verse. Those passages are not in the beginning of King so-and-so reigned. Those sentences are in the beginning of the reign of King so-and-so, where the word reign is a noun, not a verb. So that raises a different question. What do we do with that? That's actually one of the arguments that people have used for taking bereshit as being in the absolute form instead of the construct form. It's not followed by a noun. It's followed by a finite form of the verb, namely, he created. So that's an issue that I have to deal with, and shockingly, I deal with it. So if you could go on to the next slide. The Hebrew word bereshit is more precisely the word, actually the noun, reshit, preceded by the preposition b. I talked about the preposition b in a previous slide. There are several texts in the Hebrew Bible that use the preposition b plus a noun in construct followed by a finite verbal form in constructions that are exactly parallel to Genesis 1:1. So what's weird about Genesis 1:1 is you have a preposition followed by a noun in construct followed by a finite form of the verb. It's the finite form of the verb that has led scholars to believe that bereshit is not in construct, and so it's not dependent on the word that follows it. But in the research that I have done, I have found that there are constructions that are exactly parallel to those first few words of Genesis 1:1. So I list some examples on the next slide. So we can go to the next slide. So in Numbers 3:1, we have the translation, when the Lord spoke with Moses. That construction is the word yom in construct followed by a finite form of the verb. In Deuteronomy 4:15, when the Lord spoke to you, same thing. That is in Hebrew, the construction yom in construct followed by a finite form of the verb. In Psalm 138:3, we have on the day I called. Again, it is the form yom in construct followed by a finite form of the verb. And in Zechariah 8:9, when the foundation was laid, that also is in the syntax yom in construct followed by a finite form of the verb. The nice thing about these four passages is there's no dispute that I'm aware of among scholars that would treat yom as in the absolute case, because yom is written differently when it is not in the absolute and not in the construct form. If you remember back to an earlier slide, I talk about the difference between yom and yom, where yom is the construct form of that construction. There's no dispute of these texts that I'm aware of that would argue that yom in these places is not in the construct form. But in each case, they are followed by a finite form of the verb, exactly parallel to what we have in Genesis 1:1.
Okay,
So do you have any questions on these passages?
Yeah. So, and it seems like you're using a different word, yom, instead of bereshit.
I am.
For the people that are not familiar with Hebrew, are these just interchangeable? Like, can you use that similar structure together, and it'll translate? The meaning will follow, or how does that work?
Okay, so if you can go back to the previous slide, you'll see that. Oh, actually, I didn't say that the way I thought I did. So go back to slide 13. Okay, so the word yom in Hebrew is the word day. It's a designation of time. There are words, so there's another word for Hebrew that means time. The word in Genesis 1, Reshit, means beginning. I treat these the same way because I treat this as the preposition b followed by a temporal word followed by a finite form of the verb. So yom and reshit are not synonyms, but they belong to the same group of words because they are temporal designations. So we might say, we might talk about, do you remember the day my dad died? Or we might say, do you remember the year my dad died? Day and year are not the same word, but they're both temporal designations. They mean at some point in time. One was in the day my dad died, which doesn't have to be a literal day. It can be that period of time that my dad passed. Or do you remember the year that my dad died? It's the same kind of thing. So the constructions can be analogous even when they are not identical. And that's what I didn't say as well in the slide as I wanted to. In each case, we have the preposition b followed by a word that belongs to the semantic field of time. That word is in construct, and then it's followed by a finite form of the verb. And I didn't put the Hebrew in because I didn't want to confuse the readers. I'm just putting in the translations for that reason. Okay, does that clarify your question?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's a second case. Here we have the phrase but eight. The word eight, the et at the end, is the word in Hebrew that means time. So in 2 Chronicles 24:11, we have whenever the chest was brought. And that is in the form b plus the noun eight, meaning time, plus a finite form of the verb. In Jeremiah 6:15, at the time that I punished them, that is the construction b plus the noun eight, meaning time, followed by a finite form of the verb. And in 2 Chronicles 29:27, when the burnt offering began, is constructed as b plus the noun eight, meaning time, in construct, followed by a finite verbal form. There are more than just these 7 verses, but the 7 verses is enough to show that having a noun in construct followed by a finite verbal form is not unique to Genesis 1:1. It seems to occur elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. And so in my mind, the argument that the verb he created is a finite verbal form does not entail the consequence that bereshit is not in construct form. Just because we have these 7, and there's more, but 7's enough for this morning. There are 7 other constructions that are exactly analogous to the construction in Genesis 1. The only thing that changes is the word that's being used to designate the time or the period. In Genesis 1:1, it's reshit, the word beginning. In the 4 verses we looked at before, it's the word yom, meaning day. In these 3 verses, it's the word eight, meaning time. But they're all designations of time. And so that's why the syntax is analogous. Okay. Do you have any questions on these 3 verses here?
Nope.
Okay, thank you. All right. There's one other verse that is often cited in this conversation, and that is Hosea 1:2, which is generally translated, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea. The reason that this verse is so important is because the word first in Hebrew is a feminine form of the verb. The feminine form of the noun changes when it is written in the construct form. And that change is reflected in those 2 letters, A-T, at the end. So the word first in Hebrew is the word tehilat, ending with A-T. That spelling A-T shows that the word has to be in the construct form. There's no ambiguity about it because the spelling of the word, the spelling of feminine nouns that are in the construct form changes. Here, that spelling has changed. And it is followed by a finite form of the word, the finite form of the verb to speak. So here is unambiguous evidence that you can have a noun in construct followed by a finite form of the verb. And this is not my discovery. I saw this first when I was at Wheaton, when I looked at a commentary in the Anchor Bible series by Ephraim Spicer on Genesis. I think it might be the first academic commentary in the Old Testament that I ever bought. And he has about a page or so conversation about Genesis 1:1, where he brings up Hosea 1:2 as the reason that he thinks that bereshit, followed by a finite form of the verb, is in construct. Hosea 1:2 is the passage he puts a great deal of weight on. And I remember asking my Hebrew teachers about it to see if he was right. And my Hebrew teachers, they didn't agree with his conclusion, but they agreed with his observation that in Hosea 1:2, the word first was in construct, followed by a finite form of the verb. And I don't know of anyone who would disagree with Spicer on his interpretation of Hosea 1:2.
Yep. So question here. So It seems like we have a whole bunch of different reasons to think that the original bereshit is in the construct form, but it seems like there's a whole bunch of people that think otherwise. You mentioned your teachers, like maybe we could talk about it later, or do you want to talk about it now? Up to you. What's keeping them from putting it there?
Okay, so that is a very difficult question. And the reason for that is that that's asking why someone would choose an interpretation that doesn't seem to fit the grammar of the text. I'm very, very reluctant to try and to read the minds of people who want to go in a different direction. So I'd have to check. I think that Victor Hamilton in the New International Commentary series on the Old Testament, and I think that Gordon Wenham in the Word Biblical Commentary, and Klaus Westermann in the Continental Commentary series. So people from a variety of theological perspectives prefer to read Genesis 1:1 as in the beginning, as opposed to when God began creating. I'd hate to try and guess or second guess their motivations why. I don't have the superpower of reading minds. So it's my preference in these kinds of conversations simply to report that this is what I have found in the text. This is what I think the implications for that are. And then to note that there are people who disagree with me. But I am very reluctant to say, and they disagree with me for these reasons, whatever those reasons might be, because I'm not a mind reader, and I don't want to falsely represent what they might be thinking or what their arguments might be. Any one of your readers that wants to do a deeper dive on that, those are 3 commentaries that they might want to start with. The one by Hamilton in the New International Commentary on the Old Testament doesn't require a knowledge of Hebrew. The ones by Wenham and Westermann do require some Hebrew, but that's a place that people can start if they want to consult scholars who think that I am wrong.
Cool. And we'll talk about some other views later,
Sure.
why they don't take that. So we can get into
Yes,
that later.
we will.
There you go. All right. Ready to keep going?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. So it appears that there's good grammatical reason to believe that bereshit is a nouning construct, reshit, preceded by the preposition be and followed by a finite form of the verb. The last question we'd have to ask then is, can we explain why a finite form of the verb can be used in place of a noun in these kinds of constructions? Because words in construct in Hebrew are almost always followed by nouns or infinitives. So I guess 99.5% of the time, a noun in construct is going to be followed by a noun or an infinitive. In these 8 constructions from Hosea and the other slides that I've shown, and Genesis 1, so that's a total of 9. These 9 constructions are not the norm. There's no dispute about that. We would expect a noun in construct to be followed by a noun. And so the last question we have to ask then is, why is a finite form of the verb being used instead of a noun? Why couldn't they have done it differently? Well, that's where that article by Robert Holmstedt comes in. He finally, in my opinion, is the one who gives a definitive answer to that. So if you could go to the next slide, please. For those of you that want to run this down, which I'm not recommending if you don't know Hebrew, it was published in the journal Vetus Testamentum in 2008, so it's about 14 years old now. His case is built on 3 different linguistic facts about Hebrew. The first is that relative pronouns in Hebrew can be marked with the relative pronoun asher or unmarked if asher is absent. So Holmstedt quotes 2 examples. In Jeremiah 42:3, we have a translation, the way that, where the word that or asher is explicitly written in the Hebrew text. We have the translation, the way that we should walk in. But in Exodus 18:20, we have an almost identical expression, except it goes from we to they and translates the way they should walk in. And the word asher, the relative pronoun, is absent in Exodus 18:20. But other than that, the 2 constructions are identical, except for the change in the pronoun from we should walk to they should walk. So Holmstedt, this is a good example of the existence of the fact that in Hebrew, you can write the relative pronoun asher, but you don't have to. And the translation makes sense. The Hebrew makes sense, whether it's present or whether it's not. So that's the first thing. Can you go to the next slide, please? The second is that a noun in construct can be followed by a relative clause. And he quotes Leviticus 13:46, which he translates all the days that the disease is in him. The phrase the days is in construct form, and it's followed by a relative clause. In Leviticus 13:46, the word that, asher, is explicitly written in the text. So a noun in construct in Hebrew can be followed by a noun, it can be followed by a verb, and it can be followed by a relative clause that's introduced with the Hebrew word asher, just like we have in Leviticus 13:46. So that's his evidence. the thing that he then says next is the conclusion that he draws. So could you go to the next slide, please? So finally, if a relative clause can be marked or unmarked, that is marked with the word asher or marked without the word asher. And if a noun can be in construct with a marked relative clause, like we saw earlier, the way that we should go versus the way they should walk in, then it follows that a noun can be in construct with an unmarked relative clause, like in Jeremiah 46:23. The abundance Moab made, where the word abundance is in construct. Now it's not a temporal word, it's the noun abundance, but it's in construct and it is followed by a finite form of the verb. Holmsted's argument is that the abundance Moab made is really the abundance that Moab made. It's a relative clause, but the relative pronoun asher is absent from the text. So we have a noun in construct followed by an unmarked relative clause. And I think that Holmstedt is absolutely right in his grammatical analysis. So Holmstedt therefore rightly concludes in his article that in Genesis 1:1, the noun preceding the verb, that is bereshit, is not in construct with the verb itself. That's what most people, including myself, would have said prior to the publication of his article. But it is in construct with an unmarked relative clause, and thus the most accurate translation, in his opinion, of Genesis 1:1 would be something like this. In the initial period that or in which God created the heavens and the earth. It is still a subordinate clause because the word reshit is in construct, but it's in construct with an unmarked relative clause, not with a verb. And to me, that answers the question, why is it that a noun in construct is followed by a finite form of the verb? And the reason is it's followed by an unmarked relative clause, which in Hebrew would be asher, followed by the finite form of the verb, and then they just drop the word asher, so it looks like the noun is in construct with the verb itself. And to me, Holmsted's article is the final piece of the puzzle. I've often wondered, I've never doubted that a word in construct can be followed by a verb. I just never knew why. In Holmsted's argument that the construct is followed by an unmarked relative clause instead of by the verb itself was, for me, kind of the final piece of the puzzle. Okay. And I think that is it. So that is that's my best way of explaining why I think that the traditional interpretation of Genesis 1:1 is wrong. It's based on what I have been able to find throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible, the phenomena that I see in the text, and it's based on Holmsted's article, which I think finally answers the question, why can we have a noun in construct followed by a verb? And his explanation that the verb is part of an unmarked relative clause kind of clears the way for me to understand why the phenomena happened.
So what I wanted to do is so this is the Hebrew right here, and in the little section that says Hebrew, and you have your English and all that other stuff. So question, can you actually, shoot.
Oh, this is wrong. Okay, so I want you to scroll up. The Hebrew is not bereshit Elohim bara. So what I'm noticing in this screenshot is that they are using the English translation to order the Hebrew words. The Hebrew is really bereshit bara Elohim, not bereshit Elohim bara. The reason they have switched Elohim and bara is because in English we don't say in the beginning he created God, because then that would imply that someone created God. It's normal in Hebrew for the verb to precede its subject, but it's not normal in English for the verb to precede its subject. So they have this website has reversed the order of the second and the third Hebrew words because English had to do it that way. So
right.
just with that caveat, if you want to go forward, we can.
Yeah.
But I want to make clear that that is not an accurate reflection of what the Hebrew is.
All right. So would it be better to look at like this right here?
Yeah, because
interlinear?
now this is
All
right. You have the word bereshit. Okay, Hebrew's read from right to left. So we'd start where the number 1 is in is that brown? I'm slightly colorblind, so I always have to ask questions. I can tell black from blue, but that's about
it's like orangish brown.
okay. That's okay. Well, we start with the number 1, and so the first word is bereshit. The second word is bara. The third word is Elohim. The fourth word is 8, and that's not translated in English. The next word is Hashemayim. The next word is V8, where the first part of that is the conjunction, and then the second part, 8, is not translated, just like the fourth word was not translated. So now this is correct. Bereshit bara Elohim et Hashemayim ve'et haaretz. That is correct.
Gotcha. All right. So for the person that you have two things here. You have I guess this is the translation.
That's the
Can you explain the difference?
transliteration.
Transliteration. All right.
Right. The translation's in orange underneath, the Hebrew's in the middle, and the transliteration is in blue on the top.
All right. So
yeah.
So I'm under the impression that all these little squigglies at the bottom of these words and the Hebrew words weren't there until a certain time period. Is that correct?
Yes, Hebrew. So those are what we call vowel points. Hebrew, we know that Hebrew was originally not written with vowels because we have Hebrew inscriptions from the time of David and beyond that are just written with a consonantal text. So it is true that the written vowel points come much later in the history of the transmission of the text. That is right.
All right. So what can you talk about what influence that has on the text of like how we're going to translate it?
Well, so if I'm understanding your question correctly, what I'd say is this. The oldest and most reliable part of the Hebrew text are the consonants, because that's what would have been copied and written down. But you can't read consonants without vowels. So, okay, so I'm going to write, I'm going to share that. You see that?
Yep.
Okay, how many vowels are in that?
Looks like none.
None, right? But you have to add vowels to read it, right? You just wouldn't read those consonants. If you wanted to turn that into a sentence, you have to read it with vowels. Yeah, if you're going to read it, if you're going to recite it out loud, you have to add vowels to the consonants. So when I say that the consonantal text is the oldest and the vowel points were added later, that's got to be placed in the context of remembering that people have been reading these sacred texts for thousands of years. So the vowels reflect a tradition of pronunciation that would have to accompany just a purely consonantal text. So if I wanted to read that out loud, I'd have to say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I just can't recite the vowels and assume that people are going to understand what I'm saying. The issue is, how reliable is the vocalic tradition compared to the consonantal tradition? In the research that I did for my dissertation in Leviticus, I think I did it on Leviticus 17 to 26. I think in those 10 chapters, there were 20 places where I thought that the vowels in the Hebrew text were wrong. 20 places out of thousands of syllables is an infinitesimally small number. So I am not at all suggesting that we ignore the vowels in the text that you showed for us. What I am saying, though, is that those vowels and the other accent marks could be wrong. I think in this case that the Masoretes were right. I think that the that initial b in the word bereshit does indicate that the noun is in construct. So I would agree with them. There is a way to write that as in the beginning. We could say bareshit instead of bereshit, because we'd expect the vowel a if that was a definite noun. But they didn't write it that way. They wrote it with the b instead of with the ba. And that's why I think that's one of the reasons why I think that it's in construct.
Yeah. So Heiser makes the argument that because it's bereshit instead of bareshit, that the writer would have made the attempt to make it more clear if it was bareshit, and essentially like bareshit would be in the beginning, and then bereshit would be when God began to create. That seems like how he takes it. Is that something you would agree with, or do you think you need more evidence to add on to after that to make that conclusion?
So that's drawing a conclusion from the absence of evidence, and that's always a little dicey, right? I think that the argument, though, is correct. If the word bereshit were explicitly intended to not be in the construct form, they would have written it bareshit, not bereshit. So I would agree with the argument. The fact that the first vowel in Genesis 1:1 is not an A, but it's that short E, that to me is a good reason. It's not the only reason, but it fits with the other evidence that I've been able to find that first word is in construct with the words that follow it. I think that's
additional question. Mm-hmm. So do you see any reason here in the Masoretic text with the vowels to think that it couldn't have been when God began to create?
I think that if I only look at the consonants and the vowels, then it is clear to me. The one thing that gives me pause, and there is something that gives me pause, is could you point with your arrow to that little hook over the letter G in beginning? That is an accent mark. Masoretes had a different way of doing accents than we do. That is what we call a disjunctive accent. And a disjunctive accent in Hebrew is intended to separate a word from what follows it. So there's two lines of conflicting evidence around the word bereshit. The one is the short E at the beginning, which indicates that it's in construct. The second is that disjunctive accent mark that wants to separate the word bereshit from the phrase bara Elohim that follows it. Because there is conflicting evidence between the vowel and the disjunctive accent, I have to go back to the larger database that I presented in the slideshow about other places where a noun in construct is followed by a finite form of the verb. And my conclusion is that if I have to choose between the vowel, the E vowel, and the disjunctive accent, the E vowel fits the evidence of the Hebrew Bible more than the disjunctive accent fits the evidence of the Hebrew Bible. So I would acknowledge that there's that separation between bereshit and bara Elohim, but I would note it and then say that doesn't fit with the rest of the evidence that I can see in the Old Testament.
Gotcha. All right.
Right.
That answers my question very well.
Good.
All right.
Teachers love it when they hear that from their
There you go. All right. So let's see. So just to sum up, you'd say that the vowels are important, but they're not the conclusive way to take the text. Is that it?
In this text, in this particular example, I think that the vowels, the vocalic tradition that was later put in writing by the Masoretes, accurately reflects the syntax and the grammar of the Hebrew text. I don't say that 100% of the time that is true. I found a few examples in my dissertation where I thought the Masoretes were wrong, but this is not one of them. I think that the Masoretes are absolutely correct to point the preposition as though the noun is in construct with the following bara ha-Elohim, which I agree with Holmstedt is an unmarked relative clause in the beginning when God created, something like that. So here I think that the Masoretes are right. They don't always have to be right. But if I'm going to disagree with the Masoretes, then I need really strong evidence that they were mistaken. Because I'm another 1,000 years removed from that vowel tradition, and Hebrew's not my primary language the way it was for the Masoretes and the history of Rabbinic Judaism. So I will only question the Masoretes when I have compelling evidence to do so. I do not have that compelling evidence here. Here, I think the Masoretes are absolutely right.
So that's fascinating. So I've heard some people say that, it's the Masoretes were writing, 700 AD or later. And so they're basically, it seems to me that they're coming up with a translation from the original consonants. And that's still really, really far away. So, if we're talking about the original text, that seems like a long time. So what's another 1,000 years?
Well, if I were a native speaker of Hebrew, part of the broken line of Rabbinic Judaism, then that might be something. But I'm not a native speaker of Hebrew. I grew up as a Christian, not as a Jew. Hebrew is not my native language. English is my native language. And so I have to give deference to the tradition that produced our Hebrew Bible or our Old Testament without bowing down in obeisance to it. So I am willing to say that there are places in the Old Testament where the vocalic, the Masoretes got it wrong, but I do so with much reticence. I need what to me is overwhelming evidence that the Masoretes are wrong, because it could be that I am wrong and the Masoretes are right. So I have to be, just from my own personal point of view, I have to be very conservative with respect to the accuracy of the text without needing to say in every single instance the Masoretes are right. And there was no chance that the Masoretes made any kind of mistake in the Hebrew Bible. But that's a much larger philosophy of language and philosophy of text criticism conversation that we could have at another time, but we probably shouldn't have it today.
Yeah. So Heidl makes the argument that it should be translated the generic way, the traditional way. In the beginning, God created.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how he essentially critiques the view when God began to create. So if you would go ahead and read that for us, and we'll get some thoughts.
Okay. So, but terms like Bereshit, beginning, Rosh, beginning, Kedem, olden times, and Olam, eternity, when used in adverbial expressions, occur almost invariably without the article, and that in the absolute state. So the absolute state is the natural occurrence of a word. So hadavar, the word, is in the absolute state. Devar is in the construct state. So that's what he's referring to when he refers to the absolute state. In the Greek transliterations of the Hebrew text, which have come down to us, Bareshit in the opening verse of Genesis appears as Bareseth, Bareseth, Beresith, Breseth, and Bresid. Jerome translated it Bereshit. This may simply be an indication that instead of Bereshit, which we would normally expect on the basis of this and similar Hebrew words, one could also say Bareshit without any difference in meaning. The transliterations Bareseth and Bareseth support the old and generally accepted translation and interpretation of verse 1, while the absence of the definite article in Bereshit cannot be used as a point against it. Okay, so what Heidl is saying in the second part of his argument is that you have some transliterations of Hebrew using one form, Bareshit, and you have a second set of transliterations using the form Bereshit. So they must mean the same thing. That's his basic argument in that second part of the text. I would disagree with his argument. I would say that the fact that you have different transliterations of that don't mean that the transliterations mean the same thing. It means that there are differences of opinion as to whether the noun should be Bareshit in the beginning or Bereshit in the beginning of. So one of the famous problems in the New Testament is Paul's quotation of Numbers 25, I think, in 1 Corinthians 10. The chapters may be wrong because I'm not primarily a New Testament specialist. I think in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul talks about an episode where 24,000 Hebrews were killed. And in Numbers 25, it talks about there being 23,000 people killed. Well, no one would say that the numbers 23,000 and 24,000 were the same number. They would say that they are different numbers. And I would take the same point of view here. The fact that some of the transliterations say Bereshit and some say Breshit means that there was a dispute in antiquity. Should this noun be written with the definite article and be in the construct state? Or should this word be written with the shortened E and be in the construct state? I would disagree with Heidl that the fact that the two transliterations exist means that the two transliterations mean the same thing. In the same way that in Numbers 25 and 1 Corinthians 10, I think, 23,000 and 24,000 are not the same number. However we interpret the difference of that missing thousand, that's a different question. But to observe that Numbers 25 talks about 23,000 dead and 1 Corinthians 10 talks about 24,000 people dead doesn't mean that those numbers are the same. In some of the text of 1 Samuel and some of the text in 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings, when we compare them with 1 and 2 Chronicles, we see that instead of 7,000 horses, there's 700,000 horses. Well, that doesn't mean that 7,000 and 700,000 are the same. Those numbers are not the same. How we deal with those differences is a different question, but it doesn't mean that the numbers themselves are identical. And I would take the same approach with Heidel's argument here. Right. So if the Masoretes had regarded verse 1 as a temporal clause subordinate to what follows, they would probably have used the more natural form bero in order to avoid ambiguity. That form bero, can you kind of highlight that for your audience for me? Right. Okay. That is that would be an infinitive form in Hebrew. And in fact, it is very, very common for nouns that are in the construct form to be followed by an infinitive. But notice what he doesn't do here. He doesn't consider the existence of other clear nouns in construct followed by a finite form of the verb. So he doesn't mention Hosea 1:2 in this conversation, where Tehillat is clearly in construct followed by a finite form of the verb. He doesn't deal with any of the passages that I brought up where a noun like bayom or ba'et is clearly followed with a finite form of the verb. He doesn't deal with the fact that everywhere else that bereshit is used in those 4 passages in Jeremiah, it is clearly in construct. So he is right that an alternative way of writing Genesis 1:1 that would be unambiguous would be to have been bereshit baro ha-Elohim, in the beginning of the creating of God, where God is the subject of creating. He is right about that. He doesn't consider the other linguistic evidence that shows that even though the infinitive would be expected, it is not the only way to make this construction work. And that's why I brought up the passages from Numbers and from 1 Samuel and from 1st and 2nd Chronicles to give context for why the preposition "b" followed by a word that has a temporal meaning can be followed by a finite form when the noun is in construct. But it was striking to me that he did not consider any of those other passages. And I think that is, he may deal with them elsewhere, but in these paragraphs he doesn't, and I would consider that to be a substantial weakness of his argument.
So Dr. Joshua Wilson of Answers in Genesis, he wrote an article on this very subject, and I wanted to read what his quote was. He said, "The dependent clause understanding of Genesis 1:1 is not grammatically easy. It is difficult and awkward. The traditional understanding of Genesis 1:1 is grammatically easy, and the most basic principle for understanding any language is to follow the ease of grammar." So I have a question for you. Are you going against what is the basic principle of all languages when translating?
So I would argue that the traditional understanding is going against the grammar based on the examples that I have found. So I agree that when we read a language, the simplest and the most obvious is best. I disagree with Dr. Wilson that when he thinks the traditional understanding is the best, partly because if you look at Genesis 1 verses 1 through 3, and then you look at Genesis 2 verses 4 through 7, and you look at other ancient Near Eastern creation myths, such as the ones that Spicer brings out in his commentary, they're all structured the same way. They begin with a subordinate clause, and then they follow that with a main clause. The main clause for Genesis 1:1 through 3 would be the clause in verse 3. When God began creating the heavens and the earth was formless and void. Darkness was over the face of the waters, etc., etc. Then God said, "Let there be light." That would be the primary clause of that first 3 verses in Hebrew. And that is the same type of construction that we see in Genesis 2 and in the other myths from Semitic myths of creation that we find in antiquity. When I use the word myth, I am not intending to imply that I believe that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are myths. What I am intending to state is that the grammatical structure of the opening of these creation accounts all seem to follow a similar type of pattern, where it begins with a subordinate clause and it follows with the main clause. Why they do it that way, I don't know, but we do it that way too. Didn't I tell you when you left for school today that you need to pick up your room when I get home? Right? That begins with a dependent clause. When you left for school, right? Didn't I tell you when you left for school, clean up your room before I get back from work. We do it in English all the time. It's not, in my opinion, I don't know anything about Dr. Wilson. I don't know if he's primarily a Hebrew scholar or not. But as a Hebrew scholar, I would say that the grammar in Genesis 1:1 is easy to understand when you read it as a dependent clause, based on the fact that we have similar examples of the same construction elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. I'd be curious to know, does Dr. Wilson interact with Holmstedt's article? And what would he say about Holmstedt's argument that the noun in Genesis 1:1, bereshit, is in construct with an unmarked relative clause? I have a hard time seeing how someone's going to be able to make an argument against Holmstedt based on how carefully he constructs his article. And I have to believe that Holmstedt spent hours of time putting that thing, because he wrote his dissertation on the relative clause in Hebrew and Akkadian. So he knows more about relative clauses than probably anyone, any Hebrew scholar that I know, because he spent his whole dissertation writing on that one thing. It's like Dan Wallace wrote his dissertation in on the use of the definite article in Greek. Well, if you're going to write a dissertation on that, you probably know more about the definite article in Greek than any Greek scholar who's currently living on the planet. So if I wanted to disagree with Wallace, I really want to know my Greek, and I'd really want to know my evidence. I don't know whether Wilson is a Hebraist. I'll assume that he is for the sake of the argument. And then my question to him would be, then what do you do with Holmstedt's argument? What do you do with these other passages where you have the preposition "be" followed by a temporal word in construct followed by a finite form of the verb? Are those to be dismissed because they don't fit your paradigm of what easy grammar is? That's not the way I'd prefer to work. I prefer to take the evidence of the text as itself instead of trying to pigeonhole it into pre-existing sorts of categories of easy versus difficult, obscure versus plain. The text is the text. We read it the best we can.
Yeah, for sure. So just a clarification. So it seems like he was arguing that it's awkward. And when he means awkward, he means how something like Genesis 1 has a dependent clause, and then it seems like multiple circumstantial clauses, and then a main clause.
Right.
And that's just not how we speak normally in normal language. And it seems like the obvious response is that in these other creation accounts in the ancient Near East, specifically the Enuma Elish, where you have literally like 8-9 lines of circumstantial clauses,
right,
and that's in between the dependent and main clause, and we have multiple texts like that. And I just found this really interesting. So Hebraicist Jack Sasson at Vanderbilt Divinity School says the translation, because of this interesting coincidence that we have all these creation accounts like this, that the translation is to him is beyond dispute. And
I agree with him. And Sasson, I've read some of his stuff. I've read some of his commentaries. Sasson is top of the food chain when it comes to Hebrew. That doesn't mean that he's inerrant by any means, nor am I. But in this case, my estimate is that Sasson is absolutely right. Partly because he agrees with me, right? So he has to be right. But when you compare the proposed structure of Genesis 1:1-3 with Genesis 2:4-7 and these other creation accounts, they all follow the same pattern. The fact that we don't speak the way that the ancient people used to speak doesn't mean that the ancient people were wrong. It just means that they were different. They had a different cadence. They had a different grammatical structure and understanding than we do. But it doesn't make them wrong.
There's a lot of scholars out there that actually agree with your view which is super interesting to me because like before this entire conversation, like I never even heard of this idea. Like most
Yeah.
Christians have probably never even
Right.
understood that the very first verse in the Bible, like the most iconic verse ever,
Sure.
is actually there's debate about it,
Mhm.
and there's actually a long list. It's pretty crazy to me, actually.
Well, think about the Bibles that most evangelical churches are using, right? The New International Version in the beginning, the New American Standard in the beginning, the King James in the beginning. Um, I'll bet that there are or the English Standard Version. I'll bet there are very, very few churches that use the New Revised Standard Version or the New American Bible, which is a Catholic Bible, or the New Jewish Publication Society Old Testament. So if every time they read Genesis 1:1 and every time their pastor preaches out of Genesis 1:1, they hear in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, they'd never know. I can't blame them for not knowing. One of the things that my professors taught me at Wheaton is that if you want to be a careful student of the Bible, you have to read Bibles outside of your comfort zone. So when I was in Wheaton, I would regularly read NIV. That was kind of the Bible of the college. But I'd also read the Revised Standard Version, the Good News Bible, the Living Bible translation, the New American Standard Bible. And I began to get in the habit of reading other Bibles, because if different Bibles from different points of view agree on a translation, the odds are pretty good that there's a consensus about how something should be translated. But if the RSV and the New International Version and the Jewish Publication Society disagree on some verse in the Old Testament, well, then maybe the translation is not as obvious as just reading one version of the Bible would lead you to believe. Right? So the best advice that I can give to any of your readers, any of your audience, who is not trained as a professional biblical scholar, don't read one Bible. I would read different Bibles at the same time. I read the NIV in one year, then a second year I read the Revised Standard Version for my devotions, and then in the third year I'd read a different Bible. So the more exposure you get to translation options, the more informed you're going to be as to which verses are controversial and which ones are not. So if they don't get anything out of the grammatical discussion of Genesis 1:1, maybe they can get something for their devotional lives by reading other translations of the Bible along with the ones they're used to reading.
I think that sounds like a good idea. I just wanted to add one more thing, is that the CEB and the TLB actually do have your translation in there. You already mentioned the
they do
publication. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Huh. Okay, I didn't know that. Good to know. I didn't know that.
Jewish Publication Society is obviously one you already mentioned.
Right.
And then in the footnotes of the NLT, the NET, and the NRSV, it has your translation in the footnotes. It's not the main one, but it's the footnotes. So it's like, okay, this is a possible one, but we're going to put the main one, the traditional one.
We put the one that we think is right in the text, and we put a plausible alternative in the footnotes. Yeah, that's the way that that's the normal strategy for Bible translations. That is right.
So in regards to translations, and how you obviously you have your scholars, and then you have the people that are actually making the translations. So there can be some people that's a scholar that's not actually making translations, and then you have what actually gets into the hands of the lay people, the translations here. So my question to you is, why, if it's so obvious, why, in your opinion, is like why don't we see it in these main translations?
You have to ask the translators that. See, that's again, I'm very reluctant to second guess what's going on. One of the things that I will point out, though, partly because it was pointed out by a New Testament professor when I was at Wheaton, if your audience reads the New International Version as their primary text, and they open to Genesis chapter 2, and they compare it with something like the New Revised Standard Version, they will see in verse 19, I think it's in verse 19, where the New International Version adds a perfect tense to the translation. In fact, I don't have let me see if I can pull up in you are using Bible Hub or Bible Gateway for your source. I'll just bring up Bible Gateway because that's
I literally just pull up whatever comes up in Google.
Okay, so Genesis 2:19 in the New International Version. Come on, where are you? Okay, so here's what it says in the New International Version. Now, the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds in the sky. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them, and whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. That's the NIV translation of Genesis 2:9. Notice that translation had formed. Okay, that's a very important point to make, because in the New Revised Standard Version, which is the one that I will typically use, the New Revised Standard Version says, "So out of the ground the Lord God formed," not had formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. The difference is that the NIV uses had formed, a past perfect tense, and the NRSV uses formed, which is a regular narrative past. The reason that the NIV does that, apparently, is that if you translate Genesis 2:19 as a narrative past, it contradicts the order of creation in Genesis 1. So in this case, it seems, to me anyway, pretty clear that the NIV has introduced what, in my opinion, is an inferior translation of Genesis 2:19 to smooth out a contradiction in the order of creation between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. The reason I say it's an inferior translation, in my opinion, is that Hebrew has a way of indicating past perfect relationships with the main narrative. That is not what is being used in Genesis 2:19. Genesis 2:19 consistently uses the narrative past syntax, or the narrative past form of the verb, to move its narrative forward. But because the translators of the NIV are committed to a certain view of inerrancy, those two details can't be in conflict with each other. So this is a case where I think I can understand why the NIV translators chose an inferior, in my opinion, translation instead of the straightforward NRSV. But it's much harder to do that when you're asking, why are they choosing to follow the traditional interpretation, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, as opposed to what I think is the correct grammatical one? Would people stop buying their Bibles? Would people say that the NIV is going down the path of liberalism? Would the reader say, well, the translators of Genesis don't believe in creation ex nihilo as a theological doctrine anymore? Who knows why? I don't, and I'm not going to speculate as to why. That's different from what I think, but I could be wrong. What I think is happening in their translation of Genesis 2:19 compared to what I would take as the natural reading of Genesis 2:19.
Yeah. So I asked a friend on this topic, a little scholar friend, and he mentioned that, you kind of have to question the idea of if it's a money issue.
Of course you do.
because I mean, the translators, they're getting paid based on the books, and if
Sure.
if you take out the most iconic verse
Yeah.
in the Bible, like obviously that's going to hurt yourselves, especially when you have
Yeah.
America completely divided on the issue,
Right.
and
But I'm sorry for interrupting. But remember, the NIV was done in 1976, 77, 78. I would be very reluctant to assume that they were choosing their translation in anticipation of the toxic polarization that we're now seeing in the church. There wasn't that kind of, at least in my memory, there were differences, but they hadn't become toxic the way they've become in the last 5, 6, 10 years in America. I'd be very reluctant to think that there was any kind of financial consideration behind it. My guess, but it's only a guess, and it could easily be wrong. My guess is that they weren't willing to deal with the political fallout, not the economic fallout, but the political fallout of doing it that way. I don't know if you've done any research into the Good News Bible, but one of my Greek teachers told me that a criticism that the Good News Bible received was that they removed the blood of Christ from the New Testament, and they translated the blood of Christ with the death of Christ. And so my recollection of that conversation, which hopefully is pretty accurate, is that the translators caught a lot of flack for removing the blood of Christ from the Bible, even though the blood of Christ can be a way of representing the death of Christ on the cross. I didn't think that was fair, but if the Good News translation was getting that kind of flack for its translation of the blood of Christ, maybe the NIV wasn't willing to get that kind of flack for putting that translation in the notes, in the text. I do think, I don't know if it's still true because I'm using digital versions now. My recollection is that when the NIV first came out, the dependent clause translation was in a footnote, but it was not in the main text. But I no longer own a 1978 version of the NIV, so I believe that is right, but I can't be certain about it.
Gotcha. Another one that my friend mentioned was how John 3:16, talking about only begotten. Apparently, there's some. It's not much of a debate anymore about if it should be. And
right, that is, your friend is right. The word monogenes, that is the one that's used of John in John 3:16, is found elsewhere in the New Testament and in the Greek version of the Old Testament. It doesn't mean one and only son. It means the only child. That's all it means.
And then he also mentioned, the whole woman caught in adultery. Like apparently there's widespread consensus that it doesn't belong in the Bible, but obviously it's one of the most popular passages to preach on.
Right.
So there could be issues with bringing that and keeping that in the text.
Yes, that is right. I've often wondered why it is that that narrative in John 8 is regularly included in translations, but the longer ending of Mark verses 9 through 20, Mark 16 verses 9 through 20, is not. If my recollection is right, there is a consensus among New Testament scholars that Mark 16, 9 through 20 is a later addition to the ending of the Gospel of Mark, because when your story ends and the women were afraid, you kind of want something more than just the women were afraid. That's how verse 8 ends in Mark 16. And so it would make sense that people would want to add a few verses that resolve this tension that the women were afraid. And there is also a consensus that the story of the woman caught in adultery was not original to the Gospel of Mark. I think it probably reflects a true incident that happened in the ministry of Jesus, but I'm also convinced that it wasn't a part of of John's gospel as it left his hand. I think that I don't think there's much debate about either of those texts.
Right. So let's keep going into one more criticism from Heidl here. Let's go. So I'll go ahead and say it, and you can correct me if I pronounce something wrong. A final argument to be considered very briefly in this connection is derived from the fact that the most Mesopotamian creation stories begin with a subordinate clause, starting with Enuma in Babylonian and Ada in Sumerian, both of which expressions mean on the day that, or simply when, and correspond to Hebrew biyom. But if the writer of the first chapter of Genesis had patterned the initial verse after the style of the Sumerian Babylonian cosmologists, it would be most extraordinary that instead of using the Hebrew equivalent biyom, he introduced the expression bereshit, which finds no parallel in the cosmogonies of Mesopotamia. Had the biblical writer adopted the style of the Sumerian Babylonian mythographers, and had he proposed to start out with the subordinate sentence, he would be, in all probability, have begun with the normal and unequivocal phrase biyom, which is precisely what we see in Genesis 2:4 and 5:1-2, the latter passage, like the present verse, being assigned to the priestly narrative by modern scholarship. And one more thing to add. Hence, the use of bereshit is far from being the most obvious and clear-cut illustration of ultimate dependence on Mesopotamia in the Old Testament account of the creation. In fact, it points in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
So basically, I just want to summarize. So basically, he was just saying that if we're going to use the Babylonian Enuma Elish as evidence to say that, people back then used weird phrasing and awkward English, or not English, but whatever language they used, then we don't want to use Enuma Elish because it actually points the opposite. So what would you say to that?
I actually never considered that argument before, and it makes a certain amount of sense if you think that the Hebrew authors were copying the language of the text, but not its grammatical structure. So my response to Heidl, at least off the top of my head, is that the paragraph modeling Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and comparing them with the paragraph structure of the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis epic and other things like that doesn't require that the vocabulary be identical. So we have for example, in the New Testament, we know, well, I know, not everybody knows, not everyone agrees, but I know that Matthew and Luke had the Gospel of Mark in front of them, and they used the Gospel of Mark as one of their sources in writing out their own individual Gospels. But they don't copy Mark word for word in all those passages. Every once in a while, Matthew and Luke go their own way when they are writing their own Gospels. So I think that my response to Heidl would be that he is underestimating the grammatical structure of the sentence as a whole, and he is overestimating the difference between bereshit and biyom, where if biyom would fit the vocabulary of the Mesopotamian structures better. I wouldn't put a ton of weight on that. I'm going to assume that he is right because I haven't researched this issue at all myself, and I am not any longer a scholar of Akkadian, the Akkadian language. But I'm just struck by the grammatical parallels more than the vocabulary differences when I'm comparing Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and the Mesopotamian creation stories. And the fact that they changed a word here, they changed a word there, doesn't bother me too much because I'm used to that when I compare some of the laws in Exodus with some of the laws in Deuteronomy. In Exodus 20, the reason that we keep the commandment is that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. In Deuteronomy 5, the reason that we keep the Sabbath is because God rescued the people from the land of Egypt. Those are not the same thing, but they're in the same place in the Ten Commandments. So the fact that the vocabulary changes, but the grammatical structure of the sentence doesn't change is not a significant impediment in my view. Even though, just like the disjunctive accent on bereshit, it exists, but it ends up being, how do we weight the use of this word instead of that word? How do we weight the disjunctive accent in the light of the other parallel places where a finite verbal form is followed by, where a noun and construct is followed by a finite verbal form? And how do we deal with Holmstedt's article that the final argument that finite verbal form is part of an unmarked relative clause when he can find examples of those things within the Hebrew Bible? See, that's the thing that really clinches the argument for me. No one's making up an argument that Genesis 1:1 is a dependent and subordinate clause because they want it to be. They're making that argument because they see parallel examples in the Hebrew Bible that point in that direction. I happen to think that those arguments are correct. Other people will not agree with me. But if they don't agree with me, and they don't agree with Holmstedt and these other people that support that interpretation, I'd sure like to know how they deal with those. How does Heidl deal with the fact that bereshit, every other time it's used, is used in construct? How does he deal with the fact that words like bayom and ba'et and tehillah are followed by finite verbal forms when they're in construct? How does he deal with Holmstedt's argument that there are marked and unmarked Hebrew relative clauses in the Old Testament? It's for me, it's a pretty big mountain to climb to say that all of that linguistic evidence from the Hebrew Bible can be ignored because the church has traditionally believed that it means in the beginning. The church, traditionally believed that the sun revolved around the earth. It was only, with Galileo that the church began to believe that the earth revolved around the sun. So the church isn't always right. It does, by no means am I saying the church is by definition wrong either. I'm simply saying that the fact that the church believed it doesn't mean it's right. And this is one of the cases where, even though the church has traditionally believed that Genesis 1:1 should be translated in the beginning, I think that the church is wrong. And I think it's wrong because of the evidence of the Hebrew Bible, not just because I'm trying to be some agitator fomenting dissent and corruption in the church. I just happen to think that that's the way that the grammar of the text points.
Yeah, so that brings up an interesting question. So in regards to church history, you're going to have a lot of people that will think, why in the world would God allow his Bible to be misinterpreted for so long, like thousands of years? Mm-hmm. But then all of a sudden you come along or a few other scholars.
It's not me, right? Mm-hmm. Other scholars, right? Well, remember, for a long time, going into the New Testament, for the long time, for 18, 17 centuries, people thought that the Greek of the New Testament was a special form of Greek because it was so different from classical Greek. And then we started finding lots and lots of manuscripts written in the same kind of Greek that the New Testament was written in, which we call Koine, or Common Greek. Did God for 17, 18 centuries allow the church to believe that the Greek of the New Testament was a special language of the Holy Spirit because we hadn't discovered those other manuscripts? We discovered the Hittites are mentioned in the Old Testament, but we never found evidence that they existed until the 18th to the 19th century. And so people didn't always believe that there were Hittites, but then we found them, right? So did God allow the church to falsely believe that there weren't Hittites until we found them? So I think blaming God on human failures to understand the detailed intricacies of a Hebrew text is not being entirely fair to God. The church has believed things wrongly for a long time. And in my opinion, the church continues to believe things wrongly even to this day. But as a Presbyterian church minister, I believe the church is reformed and always reforming. That is, it's always trying to correct itself. Well, it doesn't need to correct itself if it's always been right. So the fact that the church has been mistaken on things like, in my opinion, slavery, on whether divorced people can be pastors, whether women can be pastors, the fact that, in my opinion, the church has been wrong about that is not primarily God's fault. And if the church has been mistaken about its interpretation of Genesis 1:1, I'm not willing to lay that at the feet of God either. That's just, we were wrong. Just like for 15 centuries, we thought that the sun revolved around the earth instead of the earth revolving around the sun.
John Salhammer, who is mentioned in Holmstedt's paper, says there could have been multiple creation counts, periods, or stages because it's a relative restrictive clause. Would this mean that there could have been other creation accounts that Genesis 1 doesn't mention, or does this simply describe how Genesis 1 creates in 7 separate days?
So that's a much larger, if I'm understanding Salhammer's quote, he is someone whose work I'm familiar with. I know the name and I'm familiar with him, but I haven't read all of his stuff. He is a very good scholar of the ancient world, however. That really comes down to the question of what kind of a text Genesis 1 is. So I don't believe that Genesis 1 is intended to be a literal historical narrative of the process by which God created the heavens and the earth, partly because there are so many parallels in the chapter. So the first creative act is, let there be light. And then God says, and there was morning and there was evening, day 1. But the heavenly objects that would allow there to be a morning and an evening, that is the sun, they don't get created until day 4. And so if you look at Genesis 1 carefully, you'll notice that God creates the light on day 1 and then creates the sun, the moon, and the stars on day 4. He creates the waters and the heavens on day 2, and then he creates the fish and the birds on day 5. He gathers the dry ground together on day 3, and then on day 6, he creates the wild animals, the vegetations, and the humans that live on it. So there seems to be a pattern where in days 1, 2, and 3, he creates cosmic space or earthly space. And on days 4, 5, and 6, he fills the space with the appropriate things. That seems to me to be more of a literary pattern than an historical pattern. You'll notice that there are 8 creative events. There are 8 different times where God says, and God said, and God said. But there are only 6 days of creation. The interesting thing is that day 1 has 1 and God said. Day 2 has 1 and God said. Day 3 has 2 and God says. Day 4 has 1 and God said. Day 5 has 1 and God said. But day 6 has 2 and God said. So that also appears to be a pattern. And there is an argument by a very good Old Testament scholar named John Walton, who is trying to argue, and I think he does so successfully, that Genesis 1 is kind of a poetic and literary attempt to frame the creation of the heavens and the earth as God's earthly temple in an analogous way to God's heavenly temple. And I think that Walton is right. I do not see Genesis 1 as being primarily an historical account of how creation happened. I see it positively as God creating sacred space for his presence to be on earth. And I see it negatively as a polemic against the ancient Near Eastern polytheism, where the sun was a god and the moon was a god and the cat was a god and the eagle was a god and so on and so forth. it's a polemic against those ancient Near Eastern mythologies, because God created all of these things that are treated as gods by the other cultures. So I don't see Genesis 1 as being primarily an historical, chronological report. I see Genesis 1 as being a polemic against ancient Near Eastern polytheism that Israel would surely have known in living in an ancient Near Eastern context, and positively as the creation of divine space for God's presence on earth, in the same way that the temple and the tabernacle are places for God's earth, and that the heavens are is God's throne. So I see those things being the primary thematic foci of Genesis 1, not the question of, is it a 24-hour day or is it a long day? Did it happen exactly in this order or not? That's why I'm not bothered by the fact that Genesis 2 and Genesis 1 have a different order of creation, and why I think the NIV translation on Genesis 2 is wrong. Pardon me. I don't see either text as being primarily an historical narrative of the exact chronology of how God created the heavens and the earth. Do I believe that God created the heavens and the earth? Yes, I do happen to believe that God created the heavens and the earth. Do I believe that there was an evening and a morning before there was a sun? No, I don't believe that at all. The parallels between the first 3 days and the second 3 days are too dramatic for me to think that this is a chronology of creation instead of something else.
Yeah, and we've had a few people on the channel that talk about that view, and the additional evidence that goes into that makes it even more probable that it's true. So you can check out a link in the description if you want to learn more about that. Maybe I missed it. Maybe you can clarify. Sailhammer says that there could have been multiple creation accounts or stages or whatever, and that's just in the language. Now, whether you think that or whether he thinks that, or it is a different question. But Is there a possibility there?
I don't know that part of Sailhammer's argument. I suppose grammatically it's possible, but really what I see happening in Genesis 1 is the author saying, when it started, this is how it's happened. The earth was formless and void, and God said, let there be light. Before God said, let there be light, did God say, I think I'd like to create something. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. So I'm just going to mix some water and some dirt and make some mud, and then I'll figure out what to do with it later. And then 2 days later, I'm going to make it into a planet. And so then he begins with the let there be light, and let there be this, and let there be that. I guess it's possible, but I'd have a hard time thinking that something like that was in the minds of the authors of Genesis 1. I think they're just trying to say, when it all started, this is how it happened, without trying to make any claim on what happened before it happened, before God said, let there be light. Whether was there, did he have an oopsie and then he tried to fix it, and then he had another oopsie and then he tried to fix it, and then he goes, let there be light, so there's those preceding created. I don't know, but it's not the first place that I would go in trying to understand what's happening in Genesis 1:1. I would be reluctant to think that kind of a distinction was in the mind of the author. But
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. But I need to qualify that by saying I'm responding to the argument without having read the argument itself. So I could be misunderstanding Sailhammer also.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you coming on here, Dr. Sun. This has been really good for me, and I'm sure it'll be for a lot of people. So most people, they have something to share, like a link, a website, or whatever. But I'm under the impression that you're not public like that. So is that correct?
No. So I'm not that guy. However, if anyone is interested, in fact, let me put this in the link so that you can see. My church has a website, which I believe is this, but I go to it automatically, so I'm not 100% sure that's right. And we have oral and written copies of the sermons that I do. And so if anyone is interested in hearing any of those sermons, they can. I don't have a website of my own because I don't have time to have a website of my own. But maybe if we have another conversation later, I will have a website that you can publicize for me, and in a sense, for other people to it, for all I know. But anyway, anyone that wants to know more about what I've been preaching or that can go here. And it's a public site. There's no password needed, so there's no monetization behind it. It's just in case anyone's interested.
Yep. So purely doing this out of the genuineness of your heart. So we appreciate that.
Well, you're very welcome. It was fun for me, and I hope that your audience doesn't get lost in the rabbit holes that I sometimes lead people down.
No, I think you did great. Anyways, right. I appreciate you coming on here, Dr. Sun.
You're very welcome.
Great talking to you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.